Chapter 11, The Mountain to Mohammed. That first year, no one, or very few, knew that we were up there in the mountains on our ranch, and so we were skipped by the door-to-door sellers. I didn't learn about that delight of country living until one drear day late the first fall. Bob was out in the woods, usefully and gainfully employed, cutting shingle bolts, and I was rattling around in the house longing for my lovely big noisy family and hating the mountains, when a little black truck sidled into the yard, a man alighted and crept to the back door, where he scratched like a little mouse. I rushed to the door, and he was so heartened by my greeting, not noting that I was glad to see anybody, that he hurriedly scrambled back into the truck and came staggering back under 4 great black suitcases. He opened the first one, and I realized that at last I was face to face with the creator of the knitting book outfits. The coat sweater made like a long tube with an immense shawl collar, the tatted evening dress, the lumpy crocheted bed jacket tied with thousands of little ribbons. The great big tam, the slip-over sweater with the waistline either crouching in the armpits or languishing just above the knees. Jack the knitter had them all and mostly in maroon, a pink so bright it could have given a coat of tan and orchid. Jack the knitter was so proud of his wares that I had a feeling he made them himself, and I pictured him stopping his truck halfway down the mountain and crawling into the back to tat up another evening dress, or maybe knit another big purple tam. He did have lovely suits knitted of yarn, as soft and light as kitten's fur, and seemingly devoid of furbelows. I tried one on, and was bitter to find the V-neck crowding the crotch for position and the skirt so tight that when I stood erect it made me look as if I were using my fanny for antennae and feeling around for a seat. As I turned down offering after offering, Jack's little watery eyes grew sadder and his little black suit shinier and shabbier, and we were both pretty desperate when he brought out the socks, the really superior wool socks. I immediately ordered 12 pairs for Bob and begged Jack to stay for dinner. He, however, seemed to have revived considerably under the stimulus of the order and briskly declined, packed his wares and left in the direction of Mrs. Kettle's, where he undoubtedly had dinner after selling all of his sweaters, including the expectant sitter suits. Bob returned from the woods and pointed out that I had ordered 12 pairs of socks, 2 sizes too small. I tried to make up my mind whether to walk in the dark and rain down to Mrs. Kettle's and tell Jack the right size, or to let the wrong ones come and go through the long exchanging process. I decided to let the wrong ones come and went shuffling off to bed with my willpower dragging around my feet like let-down suspenders. Then came Christmas and the mail order. I bought all my Christmas presents from the catalogs, which was wonderful, for I had the thrill of first choosing what I would buy if I could have anything, and then what I would actually buy. My greatest hurdle in ordering was whether or not to take a chance on multicolored. Practically everything except farm machinery came in pink, blue, green, maize, never yellow, and multicolored. It sounded as if they had stirred all of the leftover colors together as we used to do with Easter egg dyes. I was strong and limited myself to plain colors. But I felt I had erred. What if I died, and Bob sent for and buried me in a multicolored shroud, and I had never seen one? I was also fascinated by that wonderfully ambiguous term, quote, floral background, end quote. Since a flower could be anything from a forget-me-not to a yucca, that was certainly buying a pig in a poke. And so I bought many, quote, floral backgrounds, end quote, for my family. Then came spring, and the Stove Man. Along in January, Stove developed virulent digestive trouble. In fact, where his grate had been, there was a gaping hole, and I had to build my fire like a blazing fringe around the edge. Stove was, quote, taken, end quote, in January, but it was March before anything else was done about it. We of the mountains didn't dash into town for a new grate. We wore our already taut nerves to within a hair of snapping point, trying to cook on the circle of fire or that faint warm draught that wafted from the ash pit down around Stove's feet, where the pieces of grate and all of the wood had fallen, and waited for a mythical character known as the Stove Man, who was supposed to make rounds in the spring. One morning I reached the stage where I was craftily planning to chop up a chair or two and build a fire in the sink in an effort to drive Bob to some immediate action when the Stove Man arrived. With him also were a truckload of stove parts and tools, his wife and 3-year-old daughter. Stove Man quickly disemboweled Stove, something which I had been longing to do to that big black stinker all winter, spend the entrails all over the kitchen floor, and went out to the chicken house to point out to Bob the many opportunities for failure in the chicken business. This black future attitude was not from any manic depressive tendencies on the part of Stove Man, but was the reflected attitude of the farmer. The farmers wanted to be sad, and they wanted everyone who called on them to be sad. If your neighbor's chickens were each laying a double-yolked egg every day, all of his cows had just had heifer calves. His mortgage was all paid, his wheat was producing a bushel per stalk, and he had just discovered an oil gusher on the North 40. You did not mention any of these gladsome happenings. Instead, when you look at the chickens, you said, quote, a heavy lay makes hens weak and liable to disease, end quote. The neighbor, kicking sulkily at the feed trough, would reply, brings the price of eggs down, too. When you went into the barn, you looked over the heifer calves and said, lots of TB in the valley this year, some herds as high as 50%. The neighbor said, contagious abortion is around, too. Leaning morbidly on the fence around the groaning wheat fields, you said, quote, a cloudburst could do a lot of damage here, end quote. The neighbor said, quote, a heavy rain in harvest time would ruin me, end quote. I learned that our farmers were like those women who get some sort of inverted enjoyment out of deprecating their own accomplishments. Women who say, quote, this cake turned out just terribly, end quote, and then hand you a piece of angel food so light you have to hold it down to take a bite. Our farmers were big saddos, and our farmers' wives were delicate. Farmers' wives who had the strength, endurance, and energy of locomotives and the appetites of dinosaurs were, according to them, so delicate that if you accidentally brushed against them, they would turn brown like gardenias. They always felt poorly, took gallons of patent medicines, and without exception they, and all of their progeny, were so tiny at birth that they slept in a cigar box and wore a wedding ring for a bracelet. Stove Man's wife, quote, just call me Myrtle, end quote, and Darlene, the small, white, thready-limbed child, stayed in the house while Stove Man and Bob made their gloomy journey around the ranch. As lunchtime approached, with Stove still in surgery, Myrtle and I, accompanied by the drop, drop, drop of her leaky heart, made sandwiches and brewed tea over some canned heat. I offered to warm some soup or vegetables for Darlene, but Myrtle demurred with, that kid eats anything, strong as a horse. The horse ate for her lunch one white soda cracker and a sweet pickle, then hung on the back of her mother's car and whined. Not bothering to turn around and not missing a mouthful, Myrtle confronted her with threats of, "I'll warn your bottom. I'll turn you over to your dad. I'll lock the truck. I'll send for the bogeyman," all of which Darlene ignored and kept on swinging and whining. In desperation, I suggested a nap, but Myrtle said, "That kid never took a nap since she was weaned. You just don't need to sleep. Strong as a horse." Even though Darlene looked like something they had whipped up out of pipe cleaners, she certainly had endurance. She whined and swung until after 5, when they left. Much to my surprise, Mr. Myrtle became very businesslike after lunch and put stove back together with new grates and a new, more thorough ash shaker. Unfortunately, Myrtle also became businesslike and insisted on cutting out dresses for small Anne from the 8 lengths of dimity and nainsook I had brought from town the day before. I had patterns, but she scoffed at these as totally unnecessary for children's clothes. When I came in from one of my various trips to the chicken house, baby buggy, feed room, or cold frame, I found Myrtle slashing out the last dress. She stacked the cutout garments, took Darlene to the outhouse, and with, "See you next year if my heart holds out," "Quit that, Darlene, or I'll smack you," "Hope the stove holds together," they were gone. After dinner that night, I examined the ready-to-sew dresses. Something seemed to be wrong. There were 8 large round pieces of material, 1 from each length, and 8 rims from which the circles were cut. I was unable to determine which were the dresses and which the scraps. I had small, obliging Anne on the bed and tried to fit her into these strange pieces, but all we were able to work out were the foundations for 8 old-fashioned sweeping caps and matching ruffles for Anne's fat posterior. Either Myrtle had a splendid idea, which I was too stupid to grasp, or Anne was the wrong shape. "Oh, well, see you next year, Myrtle," I said, dusting off the bedside table with one of the circles and putting the rest away in my bottom drawer, where they remained as long as we lived on the ranch. For several weeks after the visit of the stove man, the weather was clear and bright, and we worked like maniacs to get caught up with spring, which raced out ahead of us each day, unfolding new tasks for us to do and cautioning us about leaving the old ones too long. Each night, Bob drove the truck down into a small valley below the house and filled 10-gallon milk cans with water, and the next morning, as soon as I dressed, I filled Stove's reservoir and my wash boiler, and between chores, I washed all day long. The clothes billowed and flapped whitely against the delphinium blue sky and the black-green hills, and at night, I brought in armloads of clean clothes smelling of blossoms and breezes and dry. For 3 weeks, I washed all day and ironed every night, and felt just like the miller's daughter in Rumpelstiltskin, for there was always more. After all, I had been heaping dirty clothes in the extra bedroom ever since September, and only washing what we had to have and what I can dry over stove. After the baby came, I had to wash for her every day, so I threw everything into the extra bedroom. Finally, one morning, I found the room emptied. I tottered back to the kitchen and emptied the wash boiler into the sink and collapsed by stove. Immediately, the sun was obscured by a heavy, dark cloud. A wind came swishing out of the burn. There was a light patter of rain, and I fell asleep. Like coming to the surface after a deep, deep drive, I came at last to the top of my sleep and heard hammering at the back door. I drifted through a heavy mist to the entryway and opened the door. It was the Raleigh man, who burst in and snapped me to attention by looking deep into my eyes and saying, quote, "I heard you got a new baby. Organs all back in place okay?" The Raleigh man sold spices, hand lotions, patent medicines, coffee, soap, lice, powder, flea powder, perfume, chocolate, all kinds of dandy things, and in addition he fancied himself a self-made physician and asked the most intimate and personal questions as he opened his truck and brought out his wares. After I had put his mind at rest about my organs, he told me all about his hernia, and I'm sure would have showed it to me if I had been a customer of a little longer standing. He told me about a bad ovarian tumor up north, a tipped uterus near, quote, town, end quote, some incurable cases of constipation in the West Valley, and a batch of ringworm down near Docktown, which had resisted every salve he had. I made him a cup of coffee and a ham sandwich, and he asked me every detail of Anne's birth. He was pleased that I had gone to the, quote, town, end quote, hospital instead of going to the city. He couldn't have been any more pleased than I, for never in my life have I spent such a delightful 2 weeks. The town hospital, run by sisters, was on a high bluff overlooking the Sound. My room had a ceiling about 16 feet high, inside shutters on the 4 tall windows which faced the Sound, old-fashioned curly maple furniture, a bathroom with a chain-pull toilet, and pale yellow walls. The sisters had their own cows, chickens, turkeys, and garden. They baked all of their own bread and thought nothing of bringing a breakfast tray with some home-canned raspberries that tasted so fresh I could almost see the dew on them, a thick pink slice of home-cured ham, scrambled eggs, hot rolls so feathery I wanted to powder my back with them, hot strong coffee, and cream I had to gouge out of the pitcher. They further spoiled me for any other hospital by having homemade ice cream and fried chicken on Sundays, and by bringing me tea and hot gingerbread, or chocolate cake, or rock cookies in the middle of the morning. In the evenings, the dear little sisters brought their sewing to my room, and we talked and laughed until the Mother Superior shooed them out and turned out my light. The prospect of 2 weeks in that heavenly place tempted me to stay pregnant all the rest of my life. But in spite of the coziness of our relationship, I did not tell this to the Raleigh man. Other door-to-door sellers were the nursery men who identified our fruit trees for us and sold us English walnut, filbert, chestnut, apricot, and peach trees. The shoe salesmen who carried no samples, only pictures, and when the brown moccasin-toed Oxford I ordered came, I found out why. The shoes were sturdy, thick-soled, heavy stiff leather, strong sewing. Gammy would have said they were, quote, baked, end quote, together. Firm lining. But they were never intended to be worn. They were so full of tongues and lining and sewing that there was no place for the foot. A person with a more fleshy, less bony foot than mine might have been able to get one on, but I doubt it. I put trees in them and put them in the closet, where they gathered dust until Anne began to crawl. She found them one day, and from then on, they were her favorite toy. She filled them with blocks and dragged them around like little wagons, and a sturdier, more lasting plaything has yet to be devised. One of the outstanding things about these factory-to-you sellers was their friendly, non-commercial attitude. Money was not important at all. All business was transacted on the cuff, and if you had the money in the house, when the goods came, fine. If you didn't, you could pay next time. It was so easy and pleasant, with everyone staying for supper or lunch, that we naturally bought more than we needed, and in many cases, more than we could afford. There was one thing about mail order. You had to send the money with the order, And it was hard on people like me who were suckers for deals like, quote, a 4-pound jar of Clover cleansing cream for only $4.98, pay when delivered, end quote, or when you can. There were also a corset lady and a house dress lady. They traveled together, and one squeezed into a corset and the other jammed into a house dress. The corset lady had piercing black eyes and a large bust and stomach apparently encased in steel, for when I brushed against her, it was like bumping into our oil drum. She was such a high-pressure saleswoman that almost before she had turned off the ignition of her car, I found myself in my bedroom in my, quote, naked strip, and, quote, being forced into a foundation garment. First she rolled it up like a life preserver, then I stepped through the leg holes, then she slowly and painfully unrolled it up over my thighs, hips and stomach, until she reached my top. Then she had me bend over, and she slipped straps over my arms, and then snapped me to a standing position. My legs were squashed so tightly together I couldn't walk a step, and I had to hold my chin up in the air, for my bust was in the vicinity of my shoulders. "Look, Ella," the corset lady called to the house dress lady. "Don't you look grand?" The house dress lady, who looked just like the corset lady except she had the piercing blue eyes, said, "That's a world of improvement, dear, a world." I inched over to the mirror and looked. At that time, I was thin as a needle, and encased in the foundation garment, I resembled nothing so much as a test tube with something bubbling out the top. Even if I had looked grand, I had to walk, and I wanted to lower my head occasionally, so I took off the foundation garment much more quickly, and not neatly so carefully as it had been put on me. The corset lady was furious and made no effort to conceal it. While the house dress lady was showing me her wares, the corset lady sat in a kitchen chair, legs wide apart, but her stomach in, bust up, and gazed stonily out the window. Some of the house dresses were quite pretty, although electric blue and lavender were the predominating colors, and they were very reasonably priced. I ordered 4 and 2 pairs of silk stockings, which turned out to be outsize, so I gave them to Mrs. Kettle. There may have been others, but they were the transients, not the regular door-to-door sellers, and not important. I believe that this bringing the store to you instead of your going to the store is a fine idea and is a strong factor in breeding contentment. After all, if you know that the Raleigh man carries only field clover and wild rose perfumes, you aren't going to go around whining for Chanel No. 5. And if you know that the house dress lady has nothing but electric blue, you're going to darn well learn to like it or wear feed sacks. Anyway, it takes the sting out of it if you know that all over the mountains and up and down the valleys, all of the women are going to be wearing electric blue house dresses and smelling like field clover and wild rose.